Nothing is supposed to hunt an orca. Then a group, mid-activity, changes behavior, tightens formation, increases speed, and travels directly away from something smaller, louder, and approaching from ahead. In a 2026 study published in Scientific Reports, the projected sound of long-finned pilot whales alone was enough to make killer whales switch from feeding or other activity into fast, directed travel away from the speaker. Their calling rose at first, then dropped into reduced output, then silence during sustained exposure. The study ran 37 separate playback experiments involving 8 individual killer whales. The result held across trials. Pilot whale calls produced measurable behavioral changes in animals that can weigh several thousand pounds more than the source of the sound. That asymmetry is where the story lives. NOAA lists killer whales at up to 32 feet long and 11 tons, with lifespans ranging from 30 to 90 years. Long-finned pilot whales reach 19 to 25 feet and weigh between 2,900 and 5,000 pounds. In one specific size and sex comparison, a large adult male killer whale against a typical adult male long-finned pilot whale, the difference can run to roughly 6,500 pounds. It's not a universal constant. Female orcas are substantially smaller than adult males, and large male pilot whales aren't trivial animals. But across the adult size ranges of both species, the visual hierarchy is clear. Killer whales are bigger, heavier, and when they open their mouths, demonstrably capable of killing almost anything in the ocean. So what it means that they consistently retreat from approaching pilot whale groups requires some unpacking. Before the mechanism, a clarification that makes the whole encounter stranger. Killer whales and long-finned pilot whales aren't distant relatives lumped together because they happen to share a stretch of cold water. Both are oceanic dolphins, members of Delphinidae, the same family that includes bottlenose dolphins, common dolphins, and about 36 other species. Long-finned pilot whales, Globicephala mellas, are commonly described as the second largest delphinids after killer whales themselves. In the North Atlantic and Norwegian Sea interactions where the most careful science has been done, the pilot whales involved are always the long-finned species. The round-headed animal with a sloping melon, a bulbous forehead, and long, curved pectoral fins shares the same broader family as the animal it's documented chasing away. They're cousins of different sizes, not separate branches of the ocean's hierarchy. And in the North Atlantic, they share more than taxonomy. Iceland's killer whales are herring specialists. A substantial part of the local population follows the Icelandic summer-spawning herring migration seasonally, moving between feeding grounds near Vestmannaeyja, the Westman Islands off Iceland's southern coast, and wintering areas in Breiðafjörður on the western coast. Herring-eating orcas coordinate their hunting with precision. They herd Atlantic herring into dense, swirling bait balls near the surface through a technique researchers call carousel feeding, a rotating approach in which individual whales take turns driving through the compressed school, often using a powerful tail slap that stuns or kills fish at the edges of the ball. The tail slap is a physical strike with enough force to be audible at the surface, and its acoustic signature has been used by researchers as a field marker of active feeding activity. The herring school that results from this coordinated effort is a concentrated, hard-won meal. Building it takes synchronized movement, communication, and timing among multiple animals. Long-finned pilot whales use the same North Atlantic waters throughout the year. NOAA describes them as living in groups of hundreds, separated into close-knit pods of roughly 50 to 100 individuals within those larger aggregations. NAMCO, the North Atlantic Marine Mammals Commission, notes they're almost always encountered in groups of tens or hundreds, rarely as solitary animals or pairs. They're deep divers. Pilot whales in the North Atlantic regularly pursue squid and fish at depths requiring extended breath-hold dives, sometimes exceeding 600 meters. Their social structure is matrilineal, organized around long-term female-led units with bonds that may persist for decades across generations of the same family group. When both species end up in the same coastal Icelandic water, the field record is now detailed enough to describe what tends to happen. Amy Seldman and colleagues assembled sightings from research vessels and whale-watching operations across 6 Icelandic regions, including Vestmannaeyjar, Breiðafjörður, and Steingrímsfjörður, spanning 2007 to 2020. They defined an interaction as one species approaching the other and potentially changing its behavior as a result. Over those 13 years, both species occupied the same area on 44 separate days. Researchers observed them simultaneously on 34 of those days. On 24 days, a measurable interaction occurred. 20 off Vestmannaeyjar in the south, 4 in Breiðafjörður on the west coast. In every described encounter, the pilot whales moved toward the killer whales. Not away from them, toward them, often at high speed, often porpoising, the arcing leaps through the surface that in cetaceans signal fast, purposeful travel, trading air for momentum as the animal covers distance. The approaches were directional and sustained. Killer whales generally moved directly away. Seldman's team classified killer whale responses in 3 categories: no response, avoidance, and high-speed avoidance. In 68% of the recorded interactions, killer whales moved away at regular travel speed. In 28%, they departed at high speed, both species porpoising, the encounter expanding into what looked from a research vessel like a sustained parallel chase with both animals airborne between strokes. The remaining encounters produced no clear killer whale response. The encounters weren't brief. Mean interaction duration was 62 minutes, with a standard deviation of 71 minutes. The range ran from 6 minutes to 286 minutes. Nearly 5 hours of documented pilot whale pursuit and killer whale avoidance in a single session. The actual head counts from those encounters clarify one of the most frequently repeated claims about this story. Online, the interaction is usually described as something like 8 to 20 orcas against hundreds of pilot whales. The species-level biology makes that sound plausible. Long-finned pilot whales can aggregate into groups of hundreds, and some wild encounters have involved very large pilot whale groups. But the Icelandic interaction data, the careful, study-specific counts from 24 documented encounters over 13 years, shows something more nuanced. Killer whale group sizes in those recorded interactions ranged from 4 to 100 individuals, with a mean of 27. Pilot whale groups in those same encounters ranged from 20 to 150 individuals, with a mean of 52. On average, pilot whales outnumbered killer whales roughly 2 to 1 in the documented encounters. High-speed avoidance was specifically associated with interactions in which pilot whales greatly outnumbered the orcas. The reliable numerical spine for this story isn't always hundreds against 8. It's a coordinated group arriving with a numerical advantage, typically in the range of 50 against 27, sometimes reaching 150 against a much smaller killer whale cluster. The broader species biology permits still larger pilot whale aggregations than anything yet recorded in these specific Icelandic interactions. But even at the documented scale, the imbalance is real and consequential. A large male killer whale is formidable against individual animals or small groups. Against 50 to 80 fast-moving, socially coordinated dolphins on a direct approach course, the calculation changes. The Norwegian Sea playback experiment from 2012 reveals what draws the pilot whales toward that calculation in the first place. C. Curie and colleagues conducted their experiment in Norwegian sea waters, where long-finned pilot whales and killer whales occur together year-round. They recorded killer whale sounds during herring feeding activity, the carousel feeding calls, the communication volleys of an actively foraging group, the acoustic signature of an orca hunt in progress, and played those recordings back to free-ranging long-finned pilot whales. One pilot whale carried a D tag, a digital acoustic and movement recording tag that captured the focal animal's depth, orientation, and acoustic environment throughout the trial. The surrounding group was monitored visually from a research vessel. The result the researchers expected to find in a species that might treat killer whales as potential predators would have been dispersion, animals scattering, falling silent, moving away from the sound. Instead, the pilot whale carrying the D tag changed course toward the playback speaker. The surrounding animals converged. Group size grew around the sound source. Travel path shifted toward the broadcast. Curie and colleagues wrote, "We demonstrated that the playback of killer whale sounds to pilot whales induced a clear increase in group size and a strong attraction of the animals towards the sound source." The paper, published 26 December 2012 in PLOS One, carried the unusually direct title, "Pilot Whales Attracted to Killer Whale Sounds," and the authors characterized their finding as the first experimental evidence that cetaceans can be attracted to the vocalizations of another cetacean species under playback conditions. Later work has added texture to that result. Research testing pilot whale responses to sounds from fish-eating versus mammal-eating killer whale ecotypes found that the attraction isn't uniform. Pilot whales can discriminate between call types from different killer whale populations, which implies their response is context-specific rather than a reflexive alarm to any orca sound. The playback sounds in Curie's 2012 experiment came from herring-feeding killer whales. Whether pilot whales from the Norwegian Sea specifically associate those calls with feeding activity, and whether they approach to compete, to harass, or for some other reason, remains an open question. What's documented is the direction of movement. Pilot whales approached. They recruited others as they moved. In the Icelandic field record, that recruitment and approach plays out in observable real space dynamics. A pilot whale group detects or approaches killer whales by acoustic, visual, or social cues, or some combination. Animals accelerate. The tight-knit matrilineal bonds within a pilot whale pod mean that when one group moves, others nearby may join. NOAA's description of close-knit pods of 50 to 100 within larger aggregations suggests that social momentum can rapidly increase numbers in a directed approach. In some Icelandic encounters, pilot whales approached the killer whales more than once. The first pursuit broke off, both species held separation of a few hundred meters, and then the pilot whales moved in again. That repeated approach, persistent, directional, from a group that consistently outnumbered the orcas, is what makes the encounter costly to ignore even before any physical contact takes place. From above, a large group of pilot whales converging on a smaller cluster of dorsal fins has been described in popular wildlife coverage as a wall of flesh, surrounding and splitting the killer whale group. The phrase doesn't appear in any of the primary research, and the pod-splitting claim is directly contradicted by one of the central findings in the 2026 playback study. When killer whales in that experiment were exposed to pilot whale calls, they responded by tightening their own group spacing. Animals aligned side by side. They coordinated travel direction. The group became more cohesive as it left, not less. Individuals closing rank rather than scattering. That's the opposite of being split apart. Cohesion during withdrawal is what a group does when it has decided to leave together, and doing so in formation reduces the risk that any individual gets isolated from the rest in a confrontational situation. The spatial pressure is documented. A large, fast-moving group of pilot whales approaching and repeatedly pursuing killer whales fits the Icelandic field record. The primary literature describes pursuit and avoidance, not encirclement and fragmentation. The encounters also don't typically resolve through injury. A 2025 paper documented two unusual interactions off southern Iceland, one on 23rd of June 2022 and another on 20th of June 2023, in which neonate long-finned pilot whales were observed in the company of killer whale groups without other pilot whales present. The killer whales in those encounters showed slow travel, social behavior, and no clear signs of predation toward the neonate pilot whales. A separate puzzle about the complexity of interspecies interaction. But the paper also reviewed the earlier agonistic encounter data from the same region. Its conclusion on contact was direct. The pilot whales in those confrontations had never been observed reaching the killer whales or engaging in close or physical contact. The 2026 Playback Studies literature review added a wider frame. Despite accumulated observations from multiple locations and years, the paper reported that physical attacks or predation by pilot whales on killer whales have never been confirmed in the research record. High-speed chases lasting tens of minutes, repeated approaches from numerically larger groups, sustained encounters of up to 286 minutes, none of that, in the documented Icelandic record, culminated in a confirmed bite, a visible wound, or a physical impact. This matters for understanding what kind of pressure pilot whales actually apply. They don't deliver injuries, they deliver disruption, extended pursuit, noise, repeated approach, and the numerical presence of a large, socially bonded group that makes the killer whale's immediate area impractical to use for hunting or undisturbed travel. That kind of pressure doesn't require combat to work, it requires persistence. The 2026 Scientific Reports paper made the acoustic component of that persistence experimentally precise. Aversive behavioral responses of killer whales to sounds of long-finned pilot whales ran 37 playback experiments involving 8 individual killer whales in North Atlantic waters. The design tested pilot whale calls alongside control stimuli on the same animals, giving the researchers within individual comparisons rather than just population-level observations. The behavioral responses to pilot whale calls were consistent. Killer whales switched from their prior activity into traveling. Speed increased. Movement became directed away from the sound source. Group cohesion increased as animals aligned and moved together. Vocal output rose initially, then declined, then reached reduced or silent levels during sustained exposure. Secondary reporting on the study described the speed increase as nearly doubling normal travel pace. The core finding doesn't require that specific figure to be telling. Animals that were feeding, resting, or socializing shifted into fast, coordinated departure in response to projected sound from a species that hadn't physically arrived. The sound alone was informationally sufficient. The study also noted that the killer whales didn't necessarily abandon the broader region permanently. Local, short-term avoidance, moving away from the immediate area of the projected calls, not vacating the wider water, was the observed pattern. That's an important qualifier. Highly mobile animals with extensive ocean ranges can absorb a local displacement without sacrificing their broader habitat. Leaving one patch of sea for a nearby one isn't the same as losing a territory. But within the immediate area, the response was consistent. Killer whale activity reversed and went quiet. The two lines of acoustic evidence, pilot whales attracted toward killer whale feeding sounds, killer whales retreating from projected pilot whale calls, raise a further question. Pilot whales are acoustically active animals. Their pods produce calls, clicks, and social vocalizations continuously. A large converging group brings its own dense acoustic environment. Could that vocal density do something to the killer whales beyond simply announcing presence? Researchers have proposed it as a possible contributing factor. Killer whale coordination during carousel feeding depends on communication calls, and their echolocation helps locate and track herring in the water column. A close, vocalizing group of 50 or 100 pilot whales might conceivably increase acoustic noise in the orca's environment, reduce communication range, or simply add a layer of uncertainty to the already complex task of coordinating a multi-animal fish hunt. The observation from the 2026 Playback study, killer whales reducing their own vocal output during pilot whale call exposure, eventually going silent, is consistent with a scenario in which the orcas are managing their acoustic environment during the encounter. Whether that silence helps them listen through the noise, reduces informational leakage to approaching pilot whales, or serves some other function isn't established by the data. What no cited study has demonstrated is intentional sonar jamming. No experiment has shown pilot whales masking killer whale echolocation clicks at a level that measurably impaired a hunt. No primary paper attributes observed orca avoidance to functional failure in killer whale sonar caused specifically by pilot whale noise. The acoustic disruption hypothesis is a plausible, researcher-proposed mechanism. Active jamming isn't established. The visible behavior, approach, pursuit, departure, remains the strongest and most directly supported evidence. Ecology offers a framework for why that departure makes sense even without acoustic disruption, without any fight, and without an orca ever being in genuine danger. Predators can be injured. That obvious fact has non-obvious consequences when it describes an animal as long-lived, skill-dependent, and socially integrated as a killer whale. NOAA lists killer whale lifespans at 30 to 90 years. Female killer whales in well-studied North Pacific populations have survived past 80. Their hunting success over those decades depends on accumulated knowledge. Feeding strategies passed within pods across generations, learned responses to seasonal prey movements, coordinated techniques that require all group members to know their role. It depends on intact social bonds within the pod and on a working body, functional teeth, undamaged jaw muscles, healthy pectoral and fluke muscles capable of sustaining the sprint and dive pattern that carousel feeding demands. A broken tooth doesn't regrow. A deep wound into jaw or fin muscle doesn't resolve quickly in an animal whose next meal requires a high-speed group chase. Impaired hunting efficiency, reduced dive capacity, or extended recovery time all impose costs on an animal whose technique took years to develop and whose pod depends on each member performing their role in a coordinated hunt. General behavioral ecology literature recognizes that predators modify their approach or avoid engagement entirely when prey items are capable of causing injury and when the energetic reward from a particular encounter doesn't justify the physical cost. For a herring-eating killer whale in Iceland, the calculation isn't, can I defeat pilot whales? It's, is staying worth it? The pilot whales aren't a herring school. They're not an isolated seal pup or an exhausted cetacean calf. They're dozens of fast-moving, powerfully built dolphins, often more numerous than the orcas, capable of sustaining approach and pursuit for tens of minutes or hours, and whose approach has already disrupted the coordinated feeding that the killer whales were investing energy in. The herring school they were working is still somewhere in those Icelandic waters. Other schools migrate through. Other windows of feeding opportunity exist. An animal with a 50-year lifespan operating in seasonally rich North Atlantic waters doesn't need a particular patch of sea at a particular moment badly enough to endure 2 hours of harassment from a numerically superior group, with the accompanying noise, disruption, and non-zero risk of physical contact. Departure is the inexpensive option. The 2026 playback studies result that killer whales didn't permanently leave the broader region after avoiding pilot whale sounds fits exactly this interpretation. Local short-term avoidance, not territorial surrender, had a cost that may be lower than the cost of remaining. Renaud de Stefanis and colleagues documented a parallel pattern in the Strait of Gibraltar in 2014. The paper, published in Acta Ethologica, documented long-finned pilot whales pursuing killer whales in the strait and framed the behavior explicitly as a question with 2 open answers: resource competition or a mobbing-like response to perceived predation risk. The Gibraltar context differs from Iceland. Different ecological pressures, different prey, different local killer whale populations. And the 2014 paper kept both explanations as live possibilities rather than settling for one. The Icelandic research hasn't settled it either. Pilot whales may approach killer whales because they regard them as threats to their own calves, as competitors for food, as social targets, or for reasons that involve all 3 simultaneously. Whatever the motive, the outcome is documented across multiple oceans, multiple study periods, and multiple research designs. There is a secondary consequence beyond the 2 species. When a killer whale group leaves a patch of water because of pilot whale pressure, smaller animals in that area gain a temporary margin of safety they didn't have before. A herring school beneath the encounter site, a porpoise on the outer edge, a smaller cetacean that routinely avoids killer whales, all experience a brief reduction in predation risk when the apex hunters depart. This isn't the pilot whales acting as protectors. There's no evidence of altruistic motive. Whatever draws pilot whales toward killer whale sounds, competition, threat response, social cascade, the effect on nearby prey is a consequence, not a goal. But consequences don't need intentions to be real. The available research hasn't measured this effect directly. No cited study has tracked prey survival rates near pilot whale orca encounters, mapped long-term killer whale exclusion zones created by pilot whale presence, or demonstrated a persistent landscape of fear attributable to pilot whale behavior. The idea that pilot whale presence creates local prey refuges is a reasonable ecological extrapolation from the short-term avoidance data. It hasn't yet been converted into direct field measurements.
What the data establishes is the immediate local consequence.
In the area of a pilot whale approach, killer whales often leave, and that departure reorganizes who is safe in that particular stretch of water for the duration of the encounter. At seasonal scales across North Atlantic herring grounds, where killer whales follow fish migrations and long-finned pilot whales occupy overlapping waters, repeated episodes of this kind could matter for smaller animals. Whether that constitutes a meaningful sanctuary effect or simply an irregular reprieve is a question the current research hasn't answered. A few things it also hasn't answered: whether silence works. In the 2026 study, killer whales reduced their calling and eventually went quiet during pilot whale call playback. Whether a quieter killer whale group is harder for approaching pilot whales to locate, whether stealth actually reduces harassment, hasn't been tested. No identified source has run an experiment measuring pilot whale detection rates of silent versus vocalizing killer whales. No documented encounter describes killer whales successfully evading pilot whale pursuit through acoustic concealment. No study has established a breaking point either, a threshold condition under which pilot whale harassment escalates into confirmed physical attack. The field record contains high-speed chases, repeated approaches, and encounters lasting nearly 5 hours. The primary literature contains no confirmed bites, no wounds attributed to pilot whale contact in North Atlantic agonistic encounters, and no reported predation of killer whales by pilot whales across any of the focal research. The hierarchy hasn't inverted. Killer whales remain among the most capable large predators in any ocean. Their diets span Atlantic herring to blue whales, depending on the population. In other regions, they've been documented preying on long-finned pilot whales. The relationship between them isn't a clean winner-loser frame. What the Icelandic and Norwegian Sea evidence establishes is something narrower and more specific. In the context of a coordinated long-finned pilot whale approach, across interactions documented over 13 years, killer whales commonly moved away. In 68% of those recorded encounters, they did so at regular travel speed. In 28%, they left at high speed, with both species porpoising. In the Norwegian Sea, recorded killer whale feeding sounds drew pilot whales toward the source, increasing group size in a directed movement. In 37 playback experiments, projected pilot whale calls moved killer whales into faster travel, tighter formation, and silence, without a single live pilot whale anywhere in the water. A large male killer whale can outweigh a typical long-finned pilot whale by roughly 6,500 pounds. In the encounter record, that individual size advantage doesn't determine the outcome. The relevant unit is groups, a fast-moving, acoustically active, numerically larger pilot whale group arriving with apparent purpose versus a killer whale group that can find herring somewhere else. The pilot whales win the immediate patch of water. The pyramid still has the same animal at the top. Apex is a human label. It describes what an animal can do across an ecosystem over time. It doesn't obligate the animal to accept every confrontation, every noisy crowd, every hour of harassment from a larger group of persistently approaching relatives. Dominance isn't a compulsion to fight. For a long-lived, skill-dependent, socially integrated hunter with a 50-year investment in its own body and technique, the cheapest victory is usually the one that doesn't need to happen at all. The ants won the bench. The eagle is still an eagle. Subscribe for more stories like this.